Hello, everyone. This is Chen, your friend. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and the late medieval China. And today, with me to further our discussion on Hegel's The Science of Logic, is my dear friend Aran. How are you, Aran?
I'm doing fine, Trent. Good to be with you here. I'm an educator of philosophy, also based in Austin, Texas. And I'm glad we're going to continue our discussion on Hegel today.
So in our previous episodes, we summarized Hegel's interpretation of Hegel's the dialectic method to the stage of something and other, and we also discussed the concept of change. So today we're basically pushing this further to cover the final stages of this book's content, namely the relationship between determination and the constitution, and in the coming episodes on limit and finitude, infinitude. So through comparing these newly acquired terms for the different aspects of a state of being, we appreciate not just what does it need to have a concept of being or thing's identity, but also Hegel's dialectical methods, namely like no purity is allowed in either negative or positive form, and this will pave the way for our final retrospective, I'm gonna put it that way, of the whole book, like revisiting certain points that we have like already mentioned, but trying to articulate them with more information from the book. And so, do you want to take us like on this quest, Aran, and tell us more about
Yes, of
determination
course.
and the Constitution? Yes.
Yeah, of course. So yes, as Trent mentioned, like there are two more substantial episodes ahead of us before we get to the end of the opening of Hegel's logic, and of course, that's like end point is very much matching Stephen Holgel's book, Opening of Hegel's Logic. We have engaged both with Holgel's interpretation and the book itself. And in these two final episodes on this book, and on the part of Hegel's Science of Logic in general, we're going to talk about further, like elaborate on some of the concepts that are going to be introduced, being in itself, being for other, determination, constitution, and ultimately finitude and infinity. And after that, we're going to have our critical responses to a critical evaluation of these points, especially Holger's interpretation, but also what we find lacking or interesting in Hegel's position. So these two episodes are going to be more, we try to figure things out, or we are going to share with you how we have figured things out. And then we will reserve a separate episode for our critical engagement. And then we finalize this discussion with a condensed retrospective kind of a episode about on like the whole transition from sheer immediacy of being to true infinity. And we're looking forward in that kind of a retrospect because we have, as we have talked about this before, the way we conduct this is that we really think about this kind of a dialectical nature of our conversation as something significant, meaning that our understanding of the text, our understanding of this concept, our understanding of the relation between these concepts and all sorts of other concepts that are we're interested in, it's developed. So it will be interesting to see, like in that summary, how things will change, how our understanding of different parts of the text will change, given that at that point we will have the whole text at that early stage in view. To give you a little bit of a context, hopefully you have followed the other videos so far, but to give you a general context of where we are in the broad sense still tied up with the relation between something and other. So the dialectical development of being, according to Hegel, from the sheer immediacy, got to the point of the structure that he calls a something. And that structure as something, again, the argument goes, imminently necessitates the existence of something Hegel calls the other. And a lot of these movements, as we're moving on, as we're discussing it, it's becoming clear how things are moved. And one of the things that is important in our discovery of the text is this importance of negation. One thing becomes more explicit about negation, a new concept pops up. And that's exactly how something led to the other, because negation is the essential part of something, and to make negation very explicit, the negation should be applied to the whole of something, and that application means that there should be a quote-unquote none-something that we call the other. Then we go to the same thing. The other is, the other has being, in the Hegelian sense. So the other must be also a something, must have all of those dialectical elements in it. So we have something and other that are kind of mirroring one another, but they are distinct from one another. And the next thing that happened that is just a very like similar kind of a move is that, okay, if otherness is embedded in any other and any something, because these two are mirroring each other, this othering should not just be externally executed, but it needs to be internally present as well. Self-othering, right? So othering must be part of any something as well. And that's what Hegel calls change. Now, what is important here in this understanding of the concept of change is that we should remember that the concept of time hasn't been introduced to this whole discussion. And we both, me and Trent, find this fascinating in our further inquiry in how Hegel's logic could be related to, Hegel's concept of history and how time, temporality, is going to come into being. This is going to be very important. Also, it's going to be very important when we start talking about finitude in the next episode. But that's talking ahead too much, because the first thing that we need to pay attention to here is the distinction that Hegel makes between in itself and for other. And some parts of the book is easier to understand why some pairs of concepts or a concept pops up. Sometimes it's much harder. I think this is not too hard to know why in itself and for other are coming at us. I think the idea is that we still are not fully in the know when it comes to the relationship between something and other, right? And this point about like the relationship between something and other that is not still clear in a lot of ways gets related to the concept of identity, right? Sometimes Hegel uses identity. Holge definitely uses identity. Me and Trent think about identity a lot when we look at this, right? And you're going to hear us talk about that in different ways that may not be directly what Hegel is talking about, but we think is very much related to the concept of identity. In a very crude, non-Hegelian, straightforward way, is that how much others constitute the being of something, right? And that idea of identity is just very, very, it could be used in all sorts of ways, or the question exists in all sorts of ways. Like, if I say my identity is that I am a doctor, right, and I'm inherently a doctor, can I just say that that identity exists in me independent from any other like recognition? That seems to be a little bit weird. But what about the opposite side? Is it that like I'm empty, I have no identity, and whatever others determine I am, I suddenly am dead? So these are just like a very basic things about this kind of identity, insofar as it's kind of like, in the case of human beings, of course, self-identification goes versus being identified by others. It's just one example of what is happening here. Because the text is complex and a lot of times very distant feeling. But I think this point about identity and others, like the role of others in identity, is just so very significant in many, many areas, right? So the way that Hegel starts talking about this, start talking about like this difference is through the two concepts originally, and these two concepts kind of leading to more sophisticated concepts called determination and constitution. For now, we're dealing with being in itself and being for other, right? And the idea of being in itself is the idea of what something is, quite separate from that of any other, right? And that's how Hegel thinks about it. Being something entails being withdrawn into oneself and exhibiting an identity quite separate from that of any other, right? So there is some level of self-relatedness that without any other exists. And remember, in the dialectical process that we have been talking about from the beginning, the concept of something as something substantial, meaning it having an identity of a kind, a very crude, basic identity, nevertheless, it's something that was introduced without first introducing other. Like Hegel didn't say that, oh, okay, there is no something without others. Originally, this other came out of a structure called something that seemed to have some identity. Now, we're going to critically assess this whole thing about identity of something in this whole process. But for now, it's just important to understand that the being in itself means this self-related existence in opposition to relation to other things. Being for other, on the other hand, means the kind of presence of this other in identity. Hegel writes, something is inextricably bound up with the very otherness from which it differs. Indeed, it is tied to otherness by the fact that its identity depends on differing from such otherness. Now, this idea is going to keep coming back at us when we talk about limit in the next episode, for instance, which is another layer of like Hegel that I think, independent from the validity or the lack of validity of his argument, is fascinating to me. That to keep this identity as something that is mine and only mine and it's untouchable, I have to create a differentiation, right? And that differentiation gets me involved with the other, right? Now, this means that to hold on to some level of self-enclosed identity, one must repel others. And as such, it must recognize the role of other in constituting what the identity originally is. And this, of course, the being for other could also be understood in the sense of how some things' identity is determined by others in all sorts of other ways. But we are talking about it at this very, very basic level. That the very fact of maintaining an identity means kind of repelling others by saying that I am not that, differing from otherness. And that makes others involved in constituting identity. So before we move on, Fred, any ideas so far?
Yes. Oh, thanks so much first for the background on like situating this being in itself and for others, for me as well as for the listeners. One thing I want to share here, I think it's really interesting. I hope it will arouse interest in you and some of our listeners, as I had that wonderful conversation with a scholar of history of languages in general the other day. And he asked me the question that what do you think was, in his theory, like the evidence for the inception or the beginning of human languages? I said, I don't know. Like, then eventually he related to me like wonderful research that he read as a specific set of like shells or jewelries with which like a human group basically used to as name tags. So language is predicated on abstract thinking, whatever, and inference reference. But the most important, the foundation of it is the naming process. And I think there's a great parallels here between names or naming as the social practice with this something other relationship. For instance, like name introduces differences between like individual human beings, like other and something you need that. And also is something self-relating, that I must respond to the name when it's pronounced. So it's something assigned to me, or I retain, or I possess, whereas another person must use it to enact the differentiating function of naming. And naming is also like not totally individuated. It requires a whole linguistic community to understand, to appreciate, like different individuals have their respective names, so that they will deploy it accordingly. Then, and also like, so it's kind of a conduit between an individual and a community, and names cannot all be the same. Otherwise, like it loses this differentiating function. I think this parallel is really interesting because we mentioned at the very beginning, like philosophy at least attempts a really big question. What does it mean to have a concept? What does it mean to think abstractly? And that requires specific names or abstract terms or concepts, and which parallels with the history of evolution of a human language. And a certain evolution behaviorists will argue that was the beginning of a human consciousness, stuff like that. So we see the parallels here, I think, like not the first time, but certain potential collaborative opportunities, at least between Hegel's conception of science of logic, or the necessary logical structure for being, and that for the human science question. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean for human beings to be like language using, like rational thinking human beings who can deploy things and create such tools, and such as provided the names to the whole process of the changing, not just themselves, but the environment that they inhabit. So yeah, that's something I get from this slide.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. And yes, I'm very interested in that parallel that you made, about naming, and like even like the birth of individuality in general, and like whether like this kind of individuation and how far the individuation in humanity goes is kind of dependent on this and this process of naming, and how it both creates identity through like limitation, and it always, this limitation is kind of a socially constituted, like recognized community, of community of naming, and not just one person naming another person, but it's just like it's a whole process. Yeah, I'm very interested in this, and hopefully later we can expand on this, and how it relates to the concept of humanity, as well. Yes, very interesting. So there are a couple of other things that like become clear in the early discussions of in itself, and for the other, and that idea is that basically there is nothing in a thing, in something, that is not uh, coming into relation to others, right? So there is nothing that is absolutely hidden, right? And we're going to talk about this more in our critical response, but I think the argument for that is something that is at the core of this kind of a basic discussion, which is that even to savor that very pure, quote unquote, pure identity, one must establish a relationship with the others, right? Like you need to, like, the castle that you're building must be in touch with the outside world. Could be a castle, right? And so in what format, in what sense, that is a different question. There is nothing about, when you build a castle, the castle has like, very, doors that are just very harsh and all like very impenetrable. But by being part of that landscape, you're in a relationship. You are externalizing yourself, right? The castle cannot escape from being in that landscape, right? Hegel talks about this by saying that there can therefore be nothing about something that does not enter into relation with another but remains hidden from view. That doesn't mean that there is no distinction between something and its other, or this kind of like identity and how it is presented outside, right? And I think the example that Hegel uses here may be helpful here. He writes, we can distinguish, for example, between the chemical composition of grass itself and the different effects it has on the stomach of a cow and that of a human being. Hegel points to simply that we are dealing with one and the same thing in each case. The point here is that a grass has an identity. What matters is that that identity shows itself, reveals itself in different relations, and those goings are not same, right? Like maybe this grass will kill this animal, will make this other animal live, will make this stone like having this impact, physical impact. All of those effects are coming out. But the image that come to my mind then is that nothing cannot stop itself from kind of pouring out the expressions, right? We are living in a constant expression of everything, right? Now, that expression could be thought as effects in a more, maybe scientific way, but in all sorts of ways. Even with like absolute hiddenness, that finds a way to be expressed as something, right? So I don't think Hegel naively is saying that there are no secrets in the world. What I'm thinking here is that he thinks there is no stopping point of expressions. Everything, whatever it is expressing itself in its relations from others. Which takes us back to something that we have talked about before, probably will come back in the summary as well, that everything Hegel says implies that there is no fundamental gap between anything, right? There is like this, there's no discreteness. It's just like it's a continuous form. And because it is a continuous form, of course, everything is kind of in touch with everything else. And if everything is receiving effects and giving effects to others. But the idea that Hegel and Holgate are battling here is that there is nothing that remains unexpressed, right? This expression, this relating to others, is not a choice. It's just happening all the time, and we can think about it at the level of physics. We can think about it as chemical in chemistry, and we can talk about living beings in biology as well. In all of these realms, things are quote unquote outing, unstoppably expressing, and this expression is not a romantic understanding of expression. It's expression in a very, very basic, crude sense of expression. Trent, any ideas here?
Yes, while reading this, I was reminded of the anthropologist of science, Bruno Latour's thesis or hypothesis that the square one for modernity is the conscious debate between Thomas Hobbes and Robert Boyles on whether absolute vacuum could exist and be produced. And I think that speaks it really adds interesting points to what you just described, that Hegel's conception about the relationship between something and other has at least two really important implications. One is like it's perfect or utter transparency, like my determination, my entity must express it in a certain way. There's nothing, including myself, to hide it from radiating out and influence other. And likewise, I receive others to influence in that regard. The second will be there's absolutely no vacuum or gap in that. Like for it's hard to visualize because this is not space or time. Either category has not yet been introduced in the state of being at this stage, but like we can easily imagine that Hegel would say that absolute vacuum should not exist in the sense that even if the vacuum is still subjected to all the interconnected relationship between different objects or like the state of being in this space. And I find that fascinating because it says to the fact that Hegel's logic or science of logic is we can contextualize it in the history of ideas as part of a modernity project. That Hegel himself was not just an active or proactive theorist of what does it mean to be modern, to have modern institution, but he himself also belongs to the like long genealogy of at least one specific civilization or tradition, namely the Western pursuit of that, to a certain extent, universal, individual, and like all-inclusive, yet retaining identity that a modernity producing process. So I think that connection here could be explored in the future when we like trying to bring this Hegelian perspective of being and their like effect, be it like a physical, chemical, or like I don't know, cultural impact or interconnection with each other into our understanding of the like theory as well as history of science.
Yes, I think these are all great points, and I love the comparison with the absolute vacuum, and I didn't know that about Latour, and like that comparison is very interesting. Yeah, I totally agree with you that although we haven't talked, like Hegel hasn't talked about vacuum, absolute vacuum, but it's very clear that he thinks there is no absolute vacuum in the sense that it is that kind of like otherness, absolutely isolated otherness is impossible. Just like the absolute nothing is possible, right? And that's very interesting. And also, I think it's a good point that you mentioned. Like when I was talking about it, I was thinking about this is a very more like a physical raw thing. But I think the impact of this in the cultural realm is going to be significant for us, right? That it's not purity of culture has also become something very odd for Hegel. That is going to change many things, right? Like like some level of like national identity when it comes to some sort of a chauvinistic stage, or when it kind of like thinks about this kind of a self-enclosed distinction, right? How much this actually is suppressing the presence of these others in that identity, right? That in many ways, it to create that type of a self-enclosed identity, one must engage in an aggressive denial of some elements in the other that might have been simply present in the identity as well. So it just becomes a weird self-denial at the end. And also this point about mutual constitution that has also been part of like our vocabulary in our conversations about Hegel, that like how different things like cultures are continuously forming one another, and the way that we need to understand them cannot be, at least in a Hegelian sense, discrete in any strong sense of the word. Now, all these conversations are going to become more relevant when we talk about determination and constitution. But there is one last thing about this in itself and for other that Hegel mentions and Holgate mentions. And like the first quote here, I believe I haven't put it there, but it is actually from Science of Logic. It's not Holgate's quote, but it's Holgate's translation. But it's the concept of thing in itself, right? And thing in itself is a concept that Kant famously, infamously, has some sort of a limitation concept on human consciousness. That our forms of sensibility are spatial and temporal, that just happens to be the case. There could be all sorts of other things. We cannot know things in themselves, because things in themselves require some sort of a godly intuition to give us any sort of full comprehension of a thing. So there is in concepts something that is radically hidden, right? And I think this kind of a radical hiddenness, like Kant's appreciation of it, Hegel's rejection of it, and our version of it. I think it's going to be interesting as we talk about the critical points at some point. That we're going to have problem with Hegel's rejection of radical difference and radical hiddenness, but it's not going to be Kant's version. So Kant's version is basically saying that we have this apparatus. This apparatus has limitations. These limitations are some are conceptual, some are sensibility based. There is something about things that we cannot know. They just lie behind our knowledge, and that's it. Right? And Hegel points that, hey, you can talk about like things in themselves as abstraction from all, being for other, and devoid them from all determination. But when you do that, and then you say, okay, it's impossible to know what the thing in itself is, of course it is impossible to know, because any question of what it is requires determinations. That doesn't mean that there is anything like substantial about thing in themselves. That just means that you're telling me to get rid of anything that makes it possible to determine something, and then say that, oh, look at this thing that I found, that is extending our determination. When you deny all the self-determination, of course you are it's a tautology. You're saying what is not being determined is not determined. You're not saying anything. This is not a deep concept that really determines our limitation. It's just saying that something that is not determined is not determined. There's nothing more to be said about it, right? And the way Hegel thinks about it is that this idea that the contradiction in Kant's account is that he wants to abstract from all, in thought, from all the spatiotemporal and empirical causal relations that exist in things, and still think of the result as a thing, right? As if this is like a thing that we cannot understand. I think that's a contradiction that Hegel finds in there, that you cannot do both, right? You can talk about a thing in abstraction from spatiotemporal and empirical causal relations, but the result is not a thing, right? And it cannot serve the function you want it to function. If you're talking about a thing, welcome to Hegel's logic. This is what makes a thing, and that's the logical explanation of it. You cannot have both of these at the same time. Trent?
No,
Anything on that?
yes, I like what you just said. And when I was reading that, I was thinking of what Hegel proposed in contradistinction from Kant's enterprise as an imminent project, and one key concept, at least there are two at least. One is Hegel tries his best not to inherit or take in concepts from his predecessors without a justification. Like all the terms we're dealing with, like change, things being for other in itself, etc., were in his world building necessary derivatives of the progress of different stages of being. And that later on, he could draw on such concepts to clarify changes or like qualitative leaps. And the other would be lack of gap or separation that Kant could incorporate like classical logics into terms like quality, quantity without really justifying it. And that he can also compartmentalize them in a way that Hegel could not tolerate. That, for instance, why, like, as you put very nicely in the second quote, that things could be abstracted from their relationships, but Hegel would say we should start with because what we observe is that mutual interacting, and there's never for a single moment in this whole enterprise with like certain things or something or whatever, without observing effect. So like the honest of a proof was on like Kant decided to introduce ways it's possible to separate the two and compartmentalize it. I think this is not just only a like disagreement between Kant and Hegel on the specific relationship between an abstracted thing or thought and that relationship between things, but also like their whole method of building up their philosophical enterprises. Yes, so that's my reaction to this slide.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, and this made me think about another element that I think how this kind of relates to what we talked before. There's not necessarily a direct response to you, just like because you mentioned there's kind of like a historical context of this historical conceptual context. Is that like another thing that I think is like clear in this point about this kind of abstraction from our forms of sensibility and how Hegel thinks about it. It has a parallel in Spinoza, and Spinoza famously like thinks about like attributes, right? And he acknowledges that we human beings have only access to two attributes: extension and mind, right? Just like these are the ways that we are in touch with the world. These are the way that we are in the world, right? But Spinoza is also dead against any idea of radical missing out. We can think about it that way, right? Because Spinoza thinks something similar to Hegel in terms of this kind of a inevitable expression, right? If you cannot stop expressing, right? So whatever is quote unquote out there, right, is expressing itself in space and time and empirical causal relations as well. There might be a different layer to existence that we don't have any access to, right? That doesn't matter. It is expressed through and through. Like it's not, there is no gap in that sense. Neither Hegel nor Spinoza think of human beings as like godlike in the sense that we have access to every layer. What they're saying is that whatever we are quote unquote missing out is being expressed in our world as well, in what we are part of, right? And that again is, I think, another expression of this impossibility of absolute vacuum, impossibility of a gap. Like there is no part of the world that is just happening at a dimension that is not in touch with the dimension that we are at, right? And because of that, whatever we are missing out, we are not missing out really, because it is expressed in our world as well. When it comes to the argument for the lack of gap, we're going to tell you more about what we think about that in our critical responses. But that, at least we can say, is Hegel's conviction here. That there is no gap, and this absence of gap is one of the main reasons why Kant's concept of the thing in itself ends up being vacuous in Hegel's eyes. Now, in all these discussions between in itself for other, these all kind of get developed into a different pair, which is still kind of in the same spirit. And these two concepts are determination and constitution, right? Determination in Holgate's words basically is what something brings to the relationship, right? Because they have something, they bring it there, right? Or the way that Holgate talks about it, the identity that the thing asserts in its relation to others. Right? Something brings something to the environment, right? And whatever squirrel in an ecosystem is just contributing something to that ecosystem, right? It is giving something there. A human being in an urban city is contributing something to that environment. That aspect that it is bringing true is a determination. And this idea of determination gets implicitly and explicitly connected with the idea of intrinsic identity, right? And that's going to be something that we are going to have a lot of discussions directly and indirectly about in our further conversations, right? And one of the reasons is that we see this in the in the book that Hegel directly mentions, that the determination of humanity, die Bestimmung des Menschen, is a thinking reason, right? And he talks about it here in this part. This is not another part of logic. That's the evident defining character of humanity, evident in our relationship to others, right? Now, this is interesting because, of course, this gets related to the idea of human nature, which we are very interested in. But also, look what happened here, and I think this is something that I am going to be very, very suspicious about in our critical assessment of this. When you think about something, we haven't we have yet to understand what a something is, right? In the sense that what we can attribute that category, right? And it seems like that Hegel thinks you can attribute it to species, right? That species is a something, human beings are a species, therefore there must be a determination for them. This is not a self-evident argument at all. The fact that there could be what qualifies as a something is very important, and I haven't heard the answer from Hegel yet of what is a proper something. But in any case, what my emphasis here is that this point about determination, what something brings to its relation with others, in his view, happens at these all sorts of levels. As much as an electron will do that humanity will do that as well. That's what I got for determination. Right? Anything there?
Yeah, so just a brief comment. I think I agree with you. We should definitely develop this more in the critical, like a synthesis theory, and it's like what in Hegel's vocabulary or thinking system constitutes or mirrors the status of being something. And I'm in favor of the understanding that like he would argue that all layers of something, however grand or minute, could be like as huge as the humanity or cosmos, or as the minor as like electron, must fulfill the same logical structure here. Like there is determination and a constitution, without which that something cannot have a like identity or intrinsic identity. Yes. So let's keep the conversation going, but move on from.
Yeah, just one thing that you said there that I think is important is that I am inclined to agree with you that that's what Hegel thinks. What I will be wondering, and we could expand on this when we talk about the critical assessment, is that that means that there cannot be any artificial bundling of random things without thinking about there is an intrinsic identity to that random bundle, right? Any compilation of random things coming together must also be a something, and that something must have a determination, right? And we can I think there is a fine line there, because I think I can understand what that random compilation of things has a determination, right? It is bringing something to its environment, however random the boundaries between that something and others are drawn. But that doesn't mean intrinsic identity, right? That's a different way to think about this, right? Because you can say these things coming up together happen to have this character, and we call this character its determination. Just like think about a very simple thing as a matter of shape, right? You can bundle up random things and it will have a shape, and that shape is part of its determination. It what brings geometrically to its environment, right? But that doesn't mean there is something essential about that. Like there is nothing about that type of a thing that if it deviates from that shape, it has hasn't lived up to itself or something of that kind, right? And I think that's gonna be the difference and the problem that we're gonna talk about more definitely in our critical conversation. Now, the second part of this is constitution, right? Beschaffenheit, which is, it's not about something that's determined by someone's own character, but it is given by the others, right? It's just like determined by the others, right? So again, the others are present, right? And their influence is present, right? And now you might think that, okay, why not thinking about like the other as just simply just constituting the thing, and that's it. Constitution and determination are the same. It's just like there's different ways to talk about the same thing. I think the idea here, and that kind of a merging together will happen when we talk about the last slide, to an extent at least. The idea is that I think Holgate writes it in an interesting way, that there must be something that is affected by another, and that something must have a defining character of its own, right? So to be recipient of an influence, something must be something first, and then be affected by. Right. That's the idea. I have problems with this idea that I will reserve for our critical conversation. But the idea is that something is, and as something that is whatever it is kind of bombarded by effects given by others, right? Like given by others, not in terms of human beings, but others in a conceptual sense, right? Which means, interestingly enough, Holgate writes that, I'm quoting, the intrinsic character of something itself undergoes change. Change brought about by the thing's internal dynamic and by the influence of other things, right? So going back to the idea of the castle not being able to kind of like hide, I think that's not only about you cannot stop expressing, but it's about you cannot stop other things stopping their expression through you, right? Like it's just, there is no escape, there is no impenetrable castle, in other words. Every castle is penetrated. It's just flow of expressions are moving in and out, right? And that even touches the very, very, very basic aspects of any something. Now, we still have problem with like using examples here for the reason that Trent mentioned and I mentioned about just like what qualifies as a something itself is a problematic question. But like, you know, you can think about this in like with all its flaws of just any sort of an object, right? Any sort of an object given like the, you know, the existence of others will change character. Like if you put a piece of iron outside in the rain, and you know, if it touches a certain other material, certain temperature, certain pressure, it's just going to become something quite different. Its transformation goes a very basic. Just like, you know, whatever, like even like at the chemical level, at the atomic level, we can just kind of manipulate, you know, electrons in all sorts of ways, and like kind of jeer them out of an orbit, right? Like things of that nature. Even at that basic level, nothing is immune to very basic transformation. So the point here then is like, again, going back to that difference between essence, which is going to be a concept that comes later in logic, and we're not going to talk about it now, and having an identity at a given time. I think at this point, determination to me means this identity at a given time, right? And that identity at a given time is expressing itself and is receiving, you know, expressions. And given what this kind of a giving and receiving goes, that might create a stable condition that identity at that specific time repeats itself at an identity at a second time, e.g., iron remains iron, right? Like it's just the Aran doesn't change, or the conditions, the expressions will be different. The Aran gets transformed into something quite different. The idea is that at any point there is an identity. That identity is the determination of that something. It has no choice other than radiating, expressing itself. At the same time, there are others exactly doing the same, and all of them are penetrating one another, and that penetration, mutual penetration of all some things and others, makes fundamental transformation not only possible but necessary.
Yes, yes. While reading this and listening to your explication of this, I'm really interested in bringing like Hegel's concept of determination and constitution to, say, cultural history or social sciences. Like one perennial debate is how to locate or reconcile a kind of research assumption that prioritizes or is grounded upon individuality or this concept, and versus those which prioritize the social or cultural structure. And Hegel's concept will be, I think it ties up to what remains, merits the category of something in our like understanding of the world. For instance, that when we say this kid is problematic, is it because like his environment or his or her environment is conducive to such like antisocial behavior? We're actually saying that like such experience or such behaviors could be accounted for by analyzing those social facts outside that individual, which radiates and penetrates every individual in this community. And so something here and other would be like individual in the society, or it was an individual with other individuals. So that's a kind of a question like inspired by like this inquiry. And I think this is a terrific question to ask. And Hegel definitely provides really provocative and really inspiring way to think about that. Identity would not really have meaning or would not really guide us to interpret any phenomenon had it not been a match between the externally given constitution and like internally decided determination. So both individuality or individual agency, because it was supported by like very complex, like say neuroscientific whatever system, which is related with the external world in a way different from say cultural values, things of that order. So how to balance that individual self-determined like determination or like tautology and the externally provided constitution of the environment of so-called society. I think it will be of great interest. Yes.
I think that's a very important point, and I agree with you that there is something charming about Hegel's account that kind of like it makes it impossible to reduce one to the other. Like they are kind of like both present and intertwined. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more for the last slide of this conversation. What I wanted to, based on what you said, I wanted to emphasize on something that I think is going to come up in our conversations later on as well. And that's the idea that you mentioned, like internal, external. I think it's that distinction is still there, right? The something has an internal structure, and there is an external effect. And when we talk about finitude, this I think I can elaborate on this a little bit more. But that distinction still exists, right? Like juxtapose this with some approach, like a process metaphysics, right? That thinks there is no real distinction between internal external, right? I think that would be an interesting contrast with this and the whole idea of identity. Like yes, identity is just a fascinating thing. Like how much of this kind of internal constitution, like Hegel is very good at telling us that internal structure, how external is that internal the structure, right? But there is a layer of this that's still unexplored, I think, which is how much what does it even say? What does it even mean to think about something as internal, like not just as a pragmatic strategy to talk about, my internal psyche, right? But as something that is about the reality of the world. And where is the justification? I mean, Hegel's justification would be that, oh, the concept of something was developed first and it has this internal structure. Therefore, there is an internal structure, and then there is this external thing. But I have doubts about the logical movement. We're going to talk about that later on. The last thing that we're going to say here is basically kind of like wrapping things up and like putting them together. Like the first quote that you see is just basically what we have said, that there's nothing is protected from influence of another thing, right? It's just constant reconstitution by others, right? And I think any stability itself is just about a renewed constitutions of a certain kind, right? Just like, it's just because of a certain temperature and pressure and like a structure of atmosphere that our stability is maintained, right? If we were in like, a completely different space, like that transformation, we keep being constituted by these external effects. It's not that we are what we are independent from them, or we are stable as opposed to something outside us. That constant influence is what makes us stable, which I think is another thing about when we think about identity as like not something pure, secluded, isolated thing, but something that is constantly due to constant change or constant reconstitution by other elements. Lastly, Holgate tells us that there is no absolute distinction between determination and constitution. This is because, he writes, on the one hand, the determination can itself be transferred to agency of other things. And on the other hand, the thing acquires a new intrinsic identity in determination precisely by being reconsidered in this way, right? And this is very interesting to me, and I think it's on par with what we have definitely talked about. And I have no understanding of how could I accept this, and at the same time, at some point, accept the concept of essence. I don't know how these two things could go together. If anything about anything is, there's no impenetrable like defense system, right? Then what happens to the concept of essence? Because essence is the doctrine of essence, is the whole volume. Like it's not just like a random concept that is going to pop up, right? If Holgate is right about this, right, and determination can itself be transferred through agency of other things, then how could we think about essence for anything? And especially going back to the point about determination of humanity, how could we think about anything as essential to what we are if whatever we find could be just transformed? In other words, how is there a concept of essence that can accept basic level transformation, right? And I think that I find that seemingly contradictory point very, very interesting, and in like kind of there might be opportunity for saving essence from a very rigid understanding and kind of like giving it a new life, or realizing that the whole concept of essence might not be valid logically.
Yes, very similar to your reaction. I was really struck in awe by this quite. It was very logical in the sense like you see where it's coming from, and like this is very much in line with each small steps that he's laying. But it's still, when you take it out and into your own understanding of the world, it becomes, what are you saying? That kind of the moment. And it's change seems here like pervasive and eternal. So the implication will be it's not just the essence, which is similar, but like being never come at a certain point and will never disappear just because we have a fragmented moment of like recognizing like being is. That's like a really radical conclusion for me, but I'm interested to see like how does Hegel justify this, for instance, like maybe in later his like doctrine of essence and stuff of that order. Yes.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely. And I believe like these themes of determination constitution might become very important for us in other inquiries. But I think we're good for now in kind of communicating what we think is going on in these sections of science of logic, and we dedicate our next episode to the last bit of this opening, and then we're gonna talk about our critical responses, and definitely these ideas and these conversations are gonna exist in our further conversation, even when we move away from Hegel. Um, so, if Trent, you don't have anything else to add, we can call this, and we're gonna see you very soon with another episode on finitude and infinity.
All right, dear listeners, to stay attuned to the finitude and infinity is coming up.